Hi, this is Ruben Lara, and today we're going to be talking about lighting our digital paintings. I'll be using Clip Studio Paint, and specifically Clip Studio Paint on iPad Pro, but it really applies to any software that allows you to assign blending modes to your layers. Now, the ability to light a painting at the end of, or even during your creation process, is something to celebrate about digital art. It's not something you can do with traditional media, in the sense that it really allows you to experiment with and give additional focus to your art during the production phase of your painting. Now, traditionally, for centuries, artists would have to make color studies to determine what tone or value range their painting would ultimately have. And those are small thumbnail paintings to experiment on before diving into a full-size final. Well, now, with digital art, we can make those decisions on the fly or even after we're done laying down the main marks. Now, this doesn't take the place of good planning or painting within a color palette, which is the subject of another discussion. But assuming we have a harmonious palette to begin with, and our complementary color saturations aren't competing with each other, we can really throw our images over the top with some creative lighting. Let's dive in now. So here I have a couple of pieces that overall I'm happy with. One is stylized, and the other is more of a traditional approach. I've painted both of them with a limited gamut, or a limited range of color saturation, and they're not overly contrasty. And the reason is because once we add lighting effects, contrast and saturation will generally increase. So by staying within a limited contrast range, I can maximize the amount of detail I'll retain when I start to ramp up the highlights. Now, to do this, we'll be using the Add blending modes. And so if you go here to your layers palette, you'll see all the different blending modes that you can have. So we'll be using the Add Glow blending mode. And of course, in Photoshop, it's called Linear Dodge Add, and they affect the image in similar ways. Now, before we dive into affecting this image, let's just see what it does using some basic shades. So I'll just open up a new canvas here, and I'm going to go ahead and just choose any hue and make sure that our saturation and values are right at about half. Go ahead and make a new layer, fill that, and we'll make yet one more layer. Grab a brush, make sure we're on full strength there. And I'm just going to go ahead and make a mark right over it. Now, because this layer is set to normal, obviously the mark I made blends right in with the layer underneath. But as soon as I set this to Add Glow, you can see that it takes all that color information, does some math calculation over it, and gives us a result that's much lighter than the original color that we laid down. Well, this is the result of the Add Glow blending mode. Now, if we grab our eyedropper tool and just kind of hover over the original color and then the resulting color, we can see that the saturation has basically stayed the same, but the value of that color has been greatly increased. It's important to understand what's happening with these colors so that we can light effectively and have some control over our lighting. So let's just go ahead and pick that original color that our base layer is on, and go ahead and just ramp this up just a little bit more and make another mark. So you can see that as we increase the value of the color that we're painting with, the result of the blending mode gets brighter and brighter. So we'll bring that up a little bit higher. And as we approach the absolute white value, you can see that we can get pretty bright. Now, there's still a little bit of tint or saturation to that color, and that's because our saturation is still at 50%. As soon as we start bringing our saturation down to 0, we'll basically get an absolute white. Now, the same thing is true as we go down on the color value range. So I'll just pick this original color again. Now remember, if I go back to our normal blending mode, we're kind of starting with this mid-tone baseline and just adding white as we go up the value chain. So let's do the opposite and start adding black and see what happens. So here's our normal color, or 50% value color at least. And we'll start going darker, adding black to our values. And you can see that as we approach a completely black value, the effect of the blending mode actually disappears. So we'll put this back on normal again, and you can see that our color is actually black, but the result of the blending mode is that it doesn't have any effect over the layers underneath it. Now, why would we use a blending mode instead of just shifting the color of our paint? Well, we can, and that would definitely be a more traditional approach. But the value is once we have a bunch of marks on our canvas, we can use the same color to affect multiple values and hues underneath it. So for example, I already have these marks laid down, and we'll add one more blending mode here. We'll set this to add glow as well. And if we just grab our original midtone color and paint across all of them, you can see that we get varying amounts of light just with that one color, because the blending mode is affecting all the imagery underneath it. Now in practice, I'll just undo that and change to a soft airbrush. We can see now that as I paint over these various color swatches, I'm getting varying degrees of what you might consider, light or glow, and that's why this one is called Add Glow. Now it's a little bit different than screen, so I'll change this to screen and just zoom in here. When the exact same colors are on the screen blending mode, we don't get quite the saturation we get with Add Glow or linear dodge. And if you notice specifically around the edges of our paint stroke, as soon as I change this to Add Glow, we can see that there's a little bit of variance between the densest part of the paint and where the brush falls off. And that's that little glow effect that we're getting with this particular blending mode, which just makes things seem a little bit more brilliant and a little bit more lit. So I'll just turn that back on again. All right, so that's the basic premise of using Add Glow. So let's go ahead and apply that to something like this painting here. Now I'm really thinking about this as if I was adding a light source to this whole scene. So as I'm painting it, I'm definitely thinking about where the directional light is, etc. As you can see from a little bit of this light cast on the trees and everything. But I'm just going to add one more layer here behind my foreground trees, and essentially this is going to affect everything underneath that, which is my rider and my background. And I'm going to go ahead and pick this general common color that I have here on the mid-ground element. I'll grab my soft airbrush, and let's just see what happens here. So I'm just going to lay in some color. Oops, let's change that to Add Glow. There we go. So you can see now I'm really just kind of painting in light. And it's just such a fun way to experiment with how this painting is lit, where the focus is going to be. So in this case, I happen to put the sun right there in the middle. Well, let's try something else. I'll just clear that layer and wonder if we just started lighting, from this end. And this guy is kind of, writing into the sunset there. Make that a little larger. So we're essentially changing the story based on our lighting scheme. Now, of course, once I've already lit these trees with paint, from a singular direction, I can only go so far in terms of making too many creative decisions. Like I wouldn't want to necessarily, add light way up here when obviously our key light is coming from below. So I'll go ahead and add that kind of general light scheme in there. Now, if I paint a little more, you'll notice that I'm only going to get so bright, and that's because the value of the color that I'm painting with only has a certain amount of whiteness to it, and that's being dictated by this value slider. Also, the more saturated a color is, the less we're approaching a pure white. So let's change this back to Add Glow, and let's say I wanted to add a sun right there on the horizon line. Then the first thing I would do is come up here and bring my value slider up higher. Maybe we'll just get this a little bit lower. And you can see that little by little, we're starting to get that nice bright center. Now again, we're not going to get to an absolute white until we desaturate our color. So the more I desaturate, the more we're getting to that, that pure white that we might be looking for. All right, so that's a little bit over the top there. So I'm just going to start over here, grab my soft airbrush. I always like to start with kind of a darker mid-tone color for my painting, because if I go too bright too soon on my value slider, I'm just going to really blow everything out. So let's just go soft. Just kind of hit these clouds in here. The nice thing about using this kind of big soft airbrush is I'm also giving it some color gradation. All right, I'm going to raise up the value, desaturate just a little bit, and maybe we kind of imply there's a little bit of a bright sunset right there on the horizon. Again, if I find the color getting too milky, then I'll just go ahead and resaturate it and make sure I'm having some nice color variation there. I can always switch drawing color and transparent color, pull a little bit of that out. And even come in here a little bit. Try to get a little bit of that bloom in there. Great. Sometimes I'll even add one more, come back to add glow, and instead of focusing so much on, this key light, which would be the sun, maybe we can experiment by using some of this skylight. And you can really see how much that's going to blow out. So these are all decisions, that you can start making as you paint. Let's do a couple more things. And in this case, let's do the opposite of lighting. And that would be maybe adding some shadow or some darkening to this. Actually, before we move on to that, I might just grab this same color again and add a little bit of a shimmer to, this water down here. Not too much, so it doesn't take away from the distraction of that center element. All right, you can go on for days. I'll leave it like that for now. Okay, now I'm going to add a little bit of vignetting with some shadow. I like to do this with curves, but there's lots of ways to do it. So I'm just going to hit my command bar button there. And as you can see, that adds an adjustment layer. Now I've set this as a command bar shortcut, but you can also access it through the layers palette, new correction layer, and tone curve. All right, so we'll double click that, and I'm just going to do a quick darken here just so I can get a sense of what's happening. I'll select the white area and clear it so that it's not affecting anything. I'll grab my soft airbrush once more, zoom out just a little bit, and just go ahead and paint in a little bit around here, like a ring around the edge. And of course, this is to taste. I find that in the same way that the light is giving us a little focus, this little curves can help accentuate where we want the viewer to see. Now, you can play around with these curves as well. They'll really shift the colors dramatically, as you can see there. Maybe I don't want to do something that much, but of course it would be up to you on your own pieces. Something like that, just real subtle. So you can see what a difference, not the biker, there we go. What a difference these blending modes made in adding a little bit more focus, drama, and saturation to our original piece. Let's try the same thing with this illustration, which I've called No Worries. All right, so I'm going to add an add glow layer here. In this case, I'm going to start with, one of the basic kind of overall colors of the scene. We'll grab our soft airbrush, make sure we're on something relatively large. And I'm just going to play around with what I want the focus to be. So maybe it's kind of around here. And you can see it's getting pretty milky right away, and that's because my saturation is fairly low. So I'll just reset that and maybe bump my saturation up just a little bit. And immediately you can see it's staying a little bit more saturated. Again, it's so easy to go overboard with this, and one of the beautiful things about a limited color palette is you're maintaining some of those beautiful grays. As soon as I start adding too much glow, we really start getting saturated, and I don't know, in my opinion, just a little bit less elegant. All right, I'm going to do the same thing here with some curves. Maybe something like that. And the other thing we can do is play around with color balance and give ourselves some overall gradient shifts. So for example, here, maybe I might want to experiment with adding some green, something like that. I can grab this mask and clear it and then just add it in where I want. So I'm taking my airbrush and just kind of painting in a little bit of that green, and you can see now that we have a little bit of that kind of greenish cast in there. But we're getting those nice shifts toward blue, on the bottom right corner. Again, I want to try to avoid overly saturating or adding too much contrast to my piece so that I retain the basic original feeling of what I painted it in. All right, those are just some quick tips about relighting your digital artwork. And whatever software you use, make sure that you maintain control of your decision-making process and have fun.